The beat-em-up genre has always been a 2D affair. That is, until consoles like the PS1 and the Sega Saturn came along, and developers like Taitos and Sega began churning out 3D beat-em-ups for all us gamers. While there are several 2D and 3D beat-em-ups to choose from, there is little to no mention of isometric beat-em-ups. Today on the Big Retro Show, I'm going to be talking about some of the isometric beat-em-ups that don't get enough love. The 80s and 90s were great times to be a kid. Join me as I dive into the world of movies, music, video games and toys, and explore what made these decades so great. This is the Big Retro Show. We kick things off with the granddaddy of beat-em-ups, and I say that because Renegade was one of the very first beat-em-ups I've ever played in the arcade. There was something so iconic about hearing the words, "Get lost, punk." And to this day I say punk the way the dude says it in the game. You play as a renegade who must take on a bunch of gangs. The boss of the gang hangs back until you defeat enough of their goons. You kick, punch, and jump kick your enemies to death. And before playing this game, I had never done that before in an arcade game. So I guess you can say it was something special. Hell, you even get to punch their skulls in if you knock them down. Super satisfying. There are 4 stages in all in this game, and as it turns out, this game was presented in an isometric viewpoint, although you could only move your character in 4 directions and not 8 like most of the beat-em-ups I'm going to be talking about today. Anyway, there was a lot of fun to be had in Renegade, and it paved the way for what was to come. Next up, I'm going to be talking about Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. Released in 1990, Moonwalker was probably the first isometric beat-em-up that featured Michael Jackson. Hell, it's the only isometric beat-em-up that featured Michael Jackson. There used to be a comic book store across the street from the high school I used to go to, and I would play this game when I wasn't playing Street Fighter II or WrestleFest. It wasn't until I got into MAME gaming that I revisited Moonwalker, mostly because I could never find it in any of the arcades except for the comic book store that has now since closed. Moonwalker follows the plotline of the 1988 movie of the same name starring none other than Michael Jackson. And I know what some of you guys are thinking about MJ, and that's fine. But if you grew up in the 80s, you couldn't turn on your TV without seeing his music videos, and we used to love them. At any rate, Sega made a beat-em-up about the movie, and surprisingly, it's pretty decent. You play as Michael Jackson donning your Moonwalker suit and hat, and your mission is to rescue child hostages from the evil Mr. Big. It's a pretty standard beat-em-up theme that sort of takes an awkward tone given the real-life allegations against the protagonist. Anywho, you take on scores of mechanical and human enemies in 5 stages. The combat in this game consists of you delivering lightning punches to your enemies and dancing them to death. If you press and hold the attack button, you start to moonwalk and deliver a more powerful attack. The enemies in this game can be frustrating, and I think it has to do with the viewpoint in which you play the game. But your chimp Bubbles helps you even the odds by transforming you into a robot, granting you the ability to shoot lasers and missiles. Each stage is punctuated by a boss fight, which aren't too difficult to beat. Being a Michael Jackson-backed game, you know the music is going to be good. The game uses music from Jackson's greatest hits, including Billie Jean and Smooth Criminal. Moonwalker's graphics are great, using colorful sprites and animations. I especially like how they captured all of Michael Jackson's dance moves and mannerisms. Of course, the Sega Genesis got an entirely different game. It was more of a side-scrolling action game. Although both games are good, the arcade version is better. A copy of Moonwalker for the Sega Genesis goes for $155 complete in box, and $58 loose. Have you played this game? The next beat-em-up I'm going to talk about isn't necessarily a true beat-em-up in the traditional sense of the word, but does contain some beat-em-up goodness. Dark Seal, aka Gate of Doom, as it was known in the US, was released in 1990 by Data East and was one of the few isometric beat-em-ups you can find in the arcade. The Gate of Doom is open and spewed vile monsters upon the land. You play as one of 4 heroes who embark on a quest to close the gate and rescue the princess for good measure. You play as a knight, wizard, bard, or ninja, each having their own weapons and advantages. The knight's weapon is the most powerful and the wizard's magic is top-notch. Poison does not affect the bard, and the ninja is the quickest fighter of the bunch. Throughout the game's 5 stages, you take on all manner of monstrosities. The game's bosses are impressive to look at and fight. The game's combat is so-so. It's a mix of melee and long-range weapons, with the knight and bard wielding the melee weapons and the ninja using ninja stars and the wizard using fire attacks. Each character can use magic attacks, and I gotta say that their magic is a bit weird. You can turn yourself into a Medusa head or a fountain of water to unleash magic attacks on your foes. It's sort of crazy, but in a good way. The enemies in this game aren't too difficult to beat, but the bosses are quarter munchers for sure, especially the second to the last boss and the end boss. Along the way, the enemies will poison and confuse you, but it's nothing you can't handle. You are an arcade gamer after all. The game's graphics and sounds are pretty decent. You fight in dungeons, in the snow, on mountaintops, and in castles. This game was ported over to the Switch and the PS4, and you can grab a digital copy for $8 on both platforms. Have you played this game? Dark Seal, or Gate of Doom in the US, did so well that Data East made a sequel for it and released it as Dark Seal 2, or Wizard's Fire in the US, just 2 years later after the original debuted. With Wizard's Fire, we get more the same type of gameplay. This time there are 2 new characters to play as, including this dwarf dude and this elf. The gameplay is very similar to its predecessor in that most of the combat is had through either melee weapons or projectile attacks. The game's plot centers around the heroes taking on the evil Volvo, a demon wizard who's hell-bent on raising armies of the undead to take over the world. It's up to you, of course, to stop him. In Wizard Fire, you play as one of the heroes and take on scores of enemies in your mission to take out the evil wizard. Much like the first game, this game is full of Dungeons and Dragons type fun, with wizards, spells, and evil monsters to defeat. The new characters, the dwarf and the elf, are extremely fun to play as and add a breath of fresh air. The dwarf is a projectile attacker, and he launches his axes at the enemies. The elf attacks with a sword and uses a sword slash to slice and dice enemies. They are both awesome additions to the game. The enemies you find in this game are much like the ones you find in the first game, but I found that the bosses were a bit easier. That is until you reach the wizard Volvo, who's designed to take every last quarter in your pocket. The sequel contains new forms of magic which adds spice to the gameplay, but aside from that there's not much new with this game, and that's okay. Both games are fun for what they are. Now I know what you're thinking, these games can hardly be considered beat-em-ups, and I wholeheartedly agree with you. But I found that they contain some basic beat-em-up elements, mostly the melee attacks, and fans of beat-em-ups will enjoy both games, and that's why I'm talking about them. You can snag a digital copy of this game on the eShop for $8 and on the PS4 for $2.50. The game also appeared on the Wii in the Data East Arcades Classic Collection that goes for $30 loose and $37 complete in box. Finally, let's talk about Taitos Dungeon Magic. You are chilling with your homies at a local tavern when all hell breaks loose. You don't mind, of course, because you're dressed for the occasion. An evil wizard kidnaps the princess, you get the picture, and is trying to use her as a sacrifice to awaken an evil spirit. Yup, here's another dude who's trying to take over the world. You get to play as one of 4 characters. There's Ash, who is the swordsman of the bunch and does not use magic. Guess there's no dungeon magic for him? Gren is so badass that he doesn't need any weapons. He uses ninja moves to dispatch his enemies. Sisti is an elf gal who is super fast but is fairly weak. Her magic attacks are second only to the wizard of the bunch, Void, who uses a wand to attack his foes. Each character has special combos, with Ash's being the most powerful and Sisti's being the weakest. While Gren is slightly weaker than Ash, he has the ability to use magic. The controls in this game are simple. You can attack, jump, grapple, and use dash attacks against your enemies. Pressing the jump and attack buttons unleashes a magic attack for everyone but Ash, who does a sword slash instead. The action starts in the village tavern and moves to the dungeon, where you can explore various rooms, gather tons of different power-ups and treasures, and take on hordes of bosses. The game is primarily a beat-em-up, but there are some platforming elements that are a nice way to break up the action. Each fighter can find a power-up weapon in the dungeon and can level up by collecting various items scattered throughout the level. The game has tons of destructible objects, but some of them contain things that can harm you. Such is the danger of the dungeon. Overall, you get more treasure and experience from destroying the objects than you do getting poisoned or whatnot. The bosses in this game are extremely impressive to look at and fight. They are drawn with colorful sprites and look awesome. Overall, the graphics in this game are a joy to look at. I also really enjoyed the sounds in this game. During some points, the music turned more soothing and, dare I say, evil, adding to the sensation of being in a dungeon. Each dungeon is laid out with a map, and you can explore every nook and cranny of the dungeon if you wish, or just head to the boss and fight them to the death. It adds some good replay value to the game if you wish to discover everything that the game has to offer. Dungeon Magic was ported over to the Taitos 2 Legends Collection, available on the PS2 and the Xbox. A copy of the PS2 goes for $15 loose and $28 complete in box, and $43 complete in box and $30 loose on the Xbox. And that's going to do it for the Big Retro Show. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to the channel, dropping a comment, and leaving a like. And I will see you next time on the Big Retro Show.